Welcome to Powerssquared Raw and Real. This is number 20, so we've actually made it through our terrible teens, right? I'm M.A. Powers.
And I'm JL Powers.
And we're gonna get right down to the funkiness of raising kids, having a political viewpoint, and the tree and the mess that can, the forest and mess and bushes that can come from that, I think. So I know I went to a protest with my kids, but you just came back from one. So tell me about it. Tell me what you guys were up to and where you were at and why.
Sure. So last Wednesday, I took Nesta and also a friend of Nesta's, a child of a good friend of mine, and we went to the Capitol in Sacramento, California, to protest a bill that the Education Senate was trying to introduce, which was going to be the type of bill that was highly discriminatory against homeschooling families. You know, legally, we are allowed to educate our children the way we see fit, which includes public school, private school, or homeschool, which is another type of private school. And they were trying, all of this happened, all of this legislation was introduced because a couple months ago, we had a terrible situation occur with a homeschooling family down in Southern California, where I think there were quite a number of kids in the family. I can't remember the exact number. I want to say 13, but and they discovered that like the kids were chained to their beds and all of these things, and they were you know, doing all of this with and had declared a private school affidavit, which allowed them to you know, fly under the radar. Now, the legislation that was introduced was kind of very reactionary about this. As we all know, abusive families come from all sorts of backgrounds. Public school kids are abused, private school kids are abused, and homeschooling families are abused. The choice of education has very little to do with how parents behave in that regard. But this legislation that was introduced was a very reactionary, but I think seemed also an attempt to basically kind of shut homeschooling down in the state. One feature on the bill was an attempt to allow to require local fire departments to enter and inspect the homes of all homeschooling families at least once a year. At some point, I thought I saw up to 4 times a year, but one time a year. They were also, an earlier part of the bill was going to require homeschooling parents to be certified teachers, which ironically, of course, you can teach in a public school or in a private school without being a certified teacher. So this was draconian legislation. You know, how many homeschooling parents can afford to go back to school for 2 or 4 years just to get certified? And as we all know, you know, homeschooling children by and large do far better than public school kids in any kind of testing situation. So the real question is certification something that's going to make a homeschooling parent a better teacher or actually a worse teacher? Is it anything that's going to help in that situation? And there were other parts of the bill, but including they were wanting to collect data on homeschooling families and then publicize it and publish it online, which seemed like a real, so we had invasion of privacy, unfair legislation, and also possibly a security risk, right? Because if addresses and other data were collected and then published online, this could be a real security risk. So it just seemed like, you know, kind of stupid legislation, to be blunt about it. And so homeschooling families around the state were showing up at the Capitol to express opposition. And they did. They lined up for I heard up to 3,000 people were there, and they did line up for 4.5 hours and state opposition. And So that was a very lengthy process, and the bill was killed.
Right.
So I took Nesta and I took his friend Maddie. They made signs,
Right.
and we went to the rally. And it was important to me, and I felt like it was very educational for the kids. But I think, and you probably feel
Right.
the same way. I do wonder, I'm taking my kids along to protest something that their major understanding of it is filtered through my understanding,
Sure.
and they're little kids. And so I do believe in including them in the democratic process, but I also wonder, you know, am I teaching them critical thinking? Am I educating them into the democratic political process and free speech, or am I propagandizing them a little bit? And so that's a question I have about it. But you also went and took your kids to a recent rally.
Well, yeah, and this rally, of course, many people participated in this rally, and this wasn't homeschool specific, since this was a rally that was for a more sensible gun legislation in the U.S. Since in reaction, of course, to the mass shootings that have been happening for years and years and years, but in particular the teenagers who came out in Florida, and people who with real rational thought and it seemed like both humility and passion were stating things that I think we've all felt, but it's never had an impact. And I felt it was important. And of course, Annie, my wife, felt it was important that we discuss just violence in general with our kids, but also that we don't all have to be, us personally, don't have to be walking around with weapons. I'm not anti-gun, but I am anti-guns that are specifically meant to kill people. That's just me. And so in doing this, of course, it's easy. I also have very young kids, and it's easy when we go to these rallies and all of our friends are there and all their kids are there, your kids are 100% on board with you, and they are getting this political reality filtered through me. And the only reason why I sit back and like, okay, there is this fine line between indoctrinating your kids to a view and giving them critical thinking skills, because of course we came from a very conservative background. We've charted our own course and not continued that, but we went to pro-life rallies that we wouldn't go to now. I did. I was in protests as a kid with our parents that were for pro-life, and these are things that I wouldn't do now. And so you always wonder, okay, I may have felt strongly on one side of things at the time, and now that I'm an adult, I do not. So I guess on the flip side of it is, I want to teach my kids core values, but what are they? What are those core values I'm trying to teach them? And I think one of the core values we would like to teach our children is the idea of free speech, and the idea of your voice is really what changes a nation, like how you use that voice, whether it's the written word or the speaking or group words or a protest. This is central to democracy. And no matter what side of the aisle you fall into, if you don't have a voice and you don't have a way of disseminating ideas and having people listen to them and then argue against them and refine them, then you don't have democracy and you don't have freedom. Freedom of speech is a core value, no matter what side of the aisle you fall onto. And as I sit back, then I wonder, I'm not sure I really went over that with my kids all that well. I was just more like, hey, yeah, no guns, we want books, not guns, that type of thing. And I got, it's fun. It was fun. It was fun to rally on that. And I think, we have friends who are totally on the other side. I have friends who are very pro-right, gun rights in the sense that you should be allowed to own whatever you want, how much of it you want, in any style or lethality that you want. And so and so it's not like we're only in this one little bubble. But I do hope that they also feel, that they have the core value that we need to be able to express our opinions and express our values. And then the legislation that comes out of that makes sense because it's been honed in an environment of free speech, and that we have to respect that. If we don't allow people from the other side to protest, and there were counter protests to the protests we were at, if you don't allow them to protest also, then you are clamping down on some of that free speech.
Right.
The legislation, though, has to fall on one side or the other to some point. It might be sort of a middling ground, but it's going to be more on one side than the other, and somebody's not going to be happy. But you have to continue to voice your opinion on that.
Yeah. So I wanted to respond to this. A couple things. One is that that core value isn't just free speech, but also participatory democracy.
Right. That's true. That is true.
So
right.
It's
well,
about,
that is speech. If you don't vote, you are voiceless.
It is about speech, but it's also about action too.
Right.
And
true.
Yes, speech is an action, but it's about getting out there. And the funny thing, of course, is that, as to my knowledge, there was nobody that was out in support of the bills that we were protesting.
Right.
Because, it was like, I don't think there was anybody that thought, yeah, this is a good idea. We should be able to invade the homes of people. And I would, the mom of the friend whom I took, she was undergoing surgery the day before, and she was trying to explain the bill to another friend. And she was trying to say, if they have the right to invade the homes of homeschoolers to inspect it for fire, then they should just have the right to invade anybody's home, right? And and that person was like, wait a minute, no, that's an invasion of privacy. And I think everybody understands that. And so there were going to be very few people who really, unless they were extremely anti-homeschooling, were going to come out in support of that bill. So funny enough, I don't think there was any support for the bill. But I could be wrong about that. But I did talk because Maddie came along and, he was just joining us, and it was really about his education process, for his parents, because they do homeschool him, but they'd been too busy and didn't really know what the bill was or anything, but they were like, yeah, take him. And I asked Maddie, do you want to take a sign? And he was like, I think I just want to come independently. And I was like, that's fine. In the end, he chose to make a sign and carry it, but I left that up to him because I told him, you don't have to. And his parents said, you have to stick with Jessica, but you don't have to agree, and you don't have to participate, right? But you have to stay with her because you're there. And those were all sorts of things that I said to him too, and probably didn't say to my own son in quite the same way. But I think, yes, having a voice and participatory democracy. But here's the thing that I think is interesting, is that when we think about, is this indoctrination, or is this, teaching kids the core values of free speech and participatory democracy and other things, here's where I think most people fall in that line. And unfortunately, I think most people see, when they're doing it with their kids, they believe they're imparting their core values and that it's a good thing.
Right.
But they get angry when they see kids participating in sort of rally or that is expressing values that they disagree with on a political.
I see that all the time.
It's just indoctrination, right? I think that we tend to be really, really blind about this. If it's a position we agree with, then we're not indoctrinating our kids. No way. We're teaching them the importance of participation in the political process, and they need to be involved because these are important issues. But that other parent who's taking their kid to that other rally that's a position we disagree with, shame on them for getting their kids involved. You know, like
Yes.
that's the
No,
way.
no, I know. I see. Yes, I see that
Really
all the time.
hypocritical.
All the time.
Really hypocritical.
For sure, for sure. And I think, yeah, no, I mean, but I also look at my kids then, because I see that all the time, you know. And then I look at my kids and I'm like, I'm taking them on this particular protest. Do they really understand it? And are they doing it just because, like, I have very little doubts that if I was very pro-gun, my kids would probably be pretty pro-gun too, just because of the way I talk about it, and the way that I live, and the way that I do it. And so I don't have a lot of stock in. I think they understand it, and I think that they feel it to the extent that I have explained it to them. And that is real, and that is true. But I also understand that when you go to a rally and there are kids there, there's a good chance that they understand it and it's real to them, to the point that they understand it and has been explained to them, and not necessarily a core thing yet. And that I shouldn't judge those kids one way or the other. On the other hand, when does that turn over? At what age does it turn over and it becomes theirs, and you have to take them seriously? And that is what I feel strongly that we have dropped the ball, because I believe that you know, at 12, 13, 14, these kids who are saying something forcefully and with thought, we should take their ideas and their thoughts at face value and just assume that they know what they're talking about, and argue if you are against it, argue it logically and not belittlingly. You know, use your arguments as if they were an adult, because we have to treat all of our citizens with respect, especially the teenagers who are coming out for or against things at this point, because we can't judge. We can only judge people from what we're hearing. We can't judge their intent. And so we need to give people the benefit of the doubt in that case. I'm just thinking about all the attacks that have happened to teens, you know, who really know, I really think know what they're talking about, more so than I do.
Well, I mean, I think kind of the distinction you're making is, okay, young kids, they may be at protests because of their parents.
Right.
Once they reach a certain critical age, we need to respect them on their own terms and not assume that they're coming from. Right. But I would say that even very young children can understand things and not necessarily be politically indoctrinated. So I would be careful to.
Sure.
So this is a really sort of stupid example in a way, but we were watching Mythbusters the other night, and my son, is 7, and we were watching it, and it was. The myths that they were trying to deconstruct were the myths that surround whether mankind ever showed up on the moon or not. Did Neil Armstrong actually go to the moon, or is this a big hoax?
Right.
And Nesta actually pointed out very logically in there, it was like, you know, they're trying to, you know, prove that the idea that this is a myth and a hoax is wrong, that NASA didn't, I mean, Nesta literally said this to me, that NASA didn't create a big hoax, but they're actually using data and instruments and material from NASA in order to prove that NASA didn't create a hoax. And he was like, I think NASA, he was like,
that's true.
Wrong.
That's true.
No, I think NASA did. And he pointed out a huge problem in how Mythbusters and I saw it too. I was like, no, he's right. Like they're saying, let's prove that this is not a hoax, and let's use the materials that NASA gathered from the moon in order to prove that they did go to the moon, right? Like there was a real logical inconsistency there that
although
on
one, 7. True, but that's like, I mean, all data and evidence that is collected for anything is collected and argued from one side, right? And so the only way you can I mean, often there may not be any other data. You know, like we're that's the only data you got. So you got to say that this data you have. I mean, that is every scientific endeavor. Just about, you have to look at the papers that they've written about. You don't even have the data, and you have to make a judgment on whether you believe the stuff that they're saying or not by the data that they're specifically pulling and giving to you. And yes, that's a problem. And yes, he is definitely true in pointing that out. But on the other hand, you have to take the data that the people collected to give you, because that is the only data that you have, and then assess whether their interpretation of the data is good or not.
Well, no, okay.
I understand your logic. I'm just saying, on the other hand,
I'm not saying it was a hoax. Hey,
no. I know that.
But what I'm saying is that to use, for example, rocks gathered from the moon to prove that they were rocks gathered from the moon,
right,
doesn't actually prove anything to the people that are like, well,
right.
You know, because you're starting with an a priori assumption that,
right,
oh, these were actually gathered from the moon, but the hoax says they weren't gathered from the moon. So how
right.
can you use them to prove that anyway? But my point,
like,
my really point is not to get into an argument about data collection and science or anything like that.
I'm just telling you.
But to point out that a 7-year-old can point out some logical inconsistencies and get things. And so we can't necessarily assume that just because they're 7, when they're articulating something, or 6 or 8 or 9 or 10. So I don't know at what age.
No, I agree with that. Yes.
At what age do we just you know, let's treat that child with respect and say,
I agree.
what do you think? And
I agree. And
why?
I mean, that's the only way to also hone your true beliefs, right? Is when people take you seriously and argue seriously with you, right?
Right.
You can't, and in a great way, you can't hone your beliefs otherwise. Otherwise, they just are what they are. Right. And there's never any formation of that belief. And so I agree with you 100%. We should take people seriously at any age. That isn't true.
All right. And we should end here because we've gone well over our 15 minutes.
Except for me. Right. Except for me. Yes.
Oh, right.
All right.
Okay. Come visit us at powerssquared.com. And we'll see you next week.
Bye.